Well, hey, everybody, Mike Griffith here. Welcome to today's Ingles on the Beat segment. And really pleased to bring on today's special guest, Georgia Athletic Director Greg McGarity. And, I got to say, since I've come on to the Georgia Beat, one of the things that I've really appreciated is the transparency that you find at the University of Georgia. You really don't get that anywhere else, where you've got an athletic director that'll pick up the phone, answer questions. And today, got to be unprecedented, Greg. A live interview. Normally these kind of interviews, we do the one-on-ones in the office, and there's a tape recorder, and sometimes the tape recorder goes off, and sometimes we say, well, maybe we'll ask it. But today we're just going live. We're just going to throw it all out there, and want to say I really appreciate you joining us here today on our Dog Nation channel.
My pleasure, Mike. It's good to see you remotely.
No doubt. So you can tell Greg is a competitor. He's ready to go toe-to-toe in one of these type of interviews. This is always fun. I want to start out, the big news last Friday that college football would return in the SEC on June 8th to campus. Now, it's not football practice. Kirby Smart's not going to be blowing the whistle. There's not going to be balls in the air. But the kids are going to be on campus. Your response was, hey, this is good. But now comes the tough part. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you meant by that?
Well, you have so much planning that's in place. Ron Corson, his staff, Kirby and his staff, and our building maintenance, really all elements of our athletic association have really reached this point to where, we'll be ready to have these young men enter our facilities on June the 8th. And so the lead up is so important. So Ron Corson and his staff have conducted a battery of questions that these young men have to answer. And so we want to make sure is when the doors are unlocked in the weight room on the 8th that we're ready to go. And so we just have to implement the plan that's in place and do our best to make sure that we've got everything in great shape, which I know we will.
Yeah, no doubt. This is where Scott Sinclair really pays off to have a veteran like this, a strength and conditioning coach. He's got to oversee this portion, kind of deliver the goods, manage the goods. Of course, Ron Corson and his staff with the screen. But what comes next? I mean, it's okay. They're on campus June 8th. To my understanding, there'll be some kids on campus before that, obviously not doing the organized workouts. But, after a couple of weeks of working out and running and sweating and lifting, is there a timeline? Do they go back home before practice starts? It's just kind of like they're on campus till the 8th, and then what?
Well, those are the details that have to be worked out because we need to identify the date to where we can start preseason practice, where it's countable activity. And right now it's just voluntary. I mean, there's no scripts. There's basically a certain number of young men that can be in the weight room at one time. And then after that, you have to totally clean the facility. Then the next wave comes in. So wave after wave is going to be the norm in our building for the foreseeable future or until practice starts. But, they'll be involved in our facility maybe an hour or so. And then there's a rest period, and then the next group sets in. So a lot of interchanging, but really they'll be isolated in the weight room and the training room as necessary only.
So now I'm guessing they'll be in the dorms. And as far as what they do outside the weight room, I mean, certainly the supervised workouts, there's certain statutes in effect. But what if the kids want to go out and play 7-on-7 on their own? Can they do that, or can anybody go out there and stop them? Or because let's face it, these guys want to be on campus. I've heard so much about, well, is it safe that they come back? Is this what I said? Look, this is what they want. They're safer on campus than they are back home. But as far as unorganized activity, can they go out and play a little 7-on-7 on their own without coaches there? Is that up to them and their discretion?
Well, that'll be determined over the coming days, whether the use of a ball in general is in question now from the CDC. So there's a lot of questions to be answered on the particulars, but we do know that from a weightlifting standpoint and cardio work that they've got the green light and certain parameters are in place. But the great reassuring thing is that Ron and Scott are on the same page. There's no bumping heads. They are joined at the hip, and certainly they're going to conduct our business the way it should be by the book. And needless to say, I've got a lot of confidence in those men to lead us down the right path.
I've said, Greg, that there's at no point has the Georgia athletic scholarship, been worth more than it is right now. And I say that because of the reserve fund that you have, and the fact that there's no cutting corners here. There's no endangered programs. I haven't heard anything about people being fired or let go. You're seeing this happen all over the country, and yet still. An example of this, the SEC put out their guidelines for when the players come back on campus in terms of the safety precautions. And then I compare it to Ron Corson's, and it looks to me like Georgia's protocol is going to be more specific and more thorough and go beyond the SEC guidelines to the point of the COVID-19 testing for the athletes. So 2 questions here. One, will in fact all the sports athletes be tested for COVID-19, whether they're symptomatic or not? And 2, what happens if one turns up positive?
Well, I'm not sure what happens when a positive is noted. I'm sure there'll be some type of isolation plan and tracing things of those lines, and Ron's in charge of that. But the protocol that we've established, and Mike, there are several other schools in the conference that are using that same protocol, but that applies to every student athlete, and all student athletes are allowed to come back June 1st, is which the NCAA permitted, and then the SEC extended that to the 8th of June. And probably in, I think, 12 of the 14 schools, their football only will be on the 6th, and then there'll be a staggered return for perhaps other sports, fall sports, but that's yet to be worked out. But as we said, football on every SEC campus, we must get it right. The worst scenario we could have is to have a number of positives on any SEC campus, and then that would delay perhaps the July timeframe. And as we all know, July is much more important than June. Because June, again, is all voluntary. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of education to be conducted. And a lot of it's going to be up to our young men to conduct themselves in a new way of life. And so we've got to do a good job of communicating that, because they're not under our supervision 24/7. So we've got to be careful, and we've got to be diligent. And if we do that, we have a chance to get back to play.
You've got a track record for that. And we've talked about Ron Corson a couple of times. He's the director of sports medicine. He's an institution into himself. He's been there, I think, since 94 or 95. He's globally renowned. And, when we talk about football players and student athletes, we just kind of throw it. But I want to get more personal here. The Dwan Mathis story a year ago, and I was away and I got a phone call, and I know a lot of people in Michigan. And so I happen to know the family before Dwan was even recruited to Georgia. He was a Michigan State recruit. So I had a background, and the way that played out almost a year ago, I think it was May 22nd, the way Ron diagnosed it, the way it went to the hospital, the way the rehabilitation's gone, the way Kirby Smart, every time I talk to the dad, Greg, he can't say enough about Georgia. He says that Georgia saved his son's life. Have you gotten to know Dwan Mathis or his father, Terrence? Have you been around that? And what insight can you share as to just how special that Dwan Mathis-Georgia relationship has become over the last year?
Well, Ron, we're always on our staff to be able to take time off. And Ron is one that is virtually there all the time. And oddly enough, that was the day he was supposed to leave with his family on a cruise. Well, the family left, and Ron stayed back and dealt with the situation at hand here. So that just tells you the type of selfless person that Ron is. I remember going to see Dwan after his surgery, went up to his room and saw him sitting in his bed, and he was a little out of it at that time. And I saw the incision, and my first thought was, oh my gosh, I cannot foresee a football helmet being placed on his head at that time, because it was just a nasty scar. But he's persevered. Ron has done such a great job. And he affects so many families because he treats every student athlete as their own child. And I think that's all you can ask. And that's one of the most important things we do is when our parents leave their children on our campus. It's kind of like a summer camp. What's the first priority when you pick up your child at a camp? You want to be sure they're safe and sound, and they might have learned a few things, might have grown up a little bit, but to be able to send your child to our school and have him taken care of in that manner. And there's so many examples. I mean, Dawn was a very obvious and very well publicized, but a lot of things don't go noticed that Ron and his staff and Aranda, his whole staff is dynamic. And I think if you ask a lot of our staff member who the MVPs are, I think they would quickly say that our training staff is right there at the top of the food chain.
And no doubt about it, and again, the personal testimony that I've heard to that. And I got to throw Kirby in there too, because Kirby was like on the phone. I mean, Terrence Mathis could not believe that the head coach of Georgia has been making all these calls and has been staying on top of it the way that he has. And I think we see Kirby on the sidelines. We see him in front of the media. He's terse. He's intense. We see him on the sidelines. He's jumping around. He's energetic. You see a different side to Kirby, though. How does he walk that line? And, he's a relatively young coach at 44. There's got to be some advantages to this, Greg. The way he connects seems very unique to me.
Well, he has a heart of gold. I think all of our coaches view their players as their children, and Kirby certainly does. So he's really tough on them. I think we've all seen him on the field, but once you turn the switch and you're in the office, and communicates so well with these young men. He communicates so well with the parents, and the communication back and forth is very, very healthy. But he's just got a way about him to where he knows how to communicate. He knows what to say at the right time. But I've always been impressed with the way Kirby handles situations, whether it's after a tough loss for the football game or whether it's dealing with a problem you got to deal with internally. He's always measured, answers the question directly. And I'm just so happy to be able to work alongside him here in Athens.
I think it'd be a pretty good duo there, I'd say. Now, recently we were talking about the coming fall, and I think everyone is hopeful to have a full stadium. I think that's kind of been the company line, is that, Greg Sankey is planning for the season to start on time in the SEC. The idea is to have full stadiums. However, you've qualified that. There's a lot of different scenarios. I mean, how many scenarios are there in terms of, what the intent is? There a 20%, a 50%, a 75%? Is it social distancing, mask, ticket priority? I mean, how do you channel through all of this, Greg? I've got to imagine that there's just a daily communications, not just with the ADs across the league, but on your staff and some of these groups that President Moorhead has put together.
Well, we've got a number of plans. When we have to make a decision, we will have to make it based on the definition of mass gatherings. Now, that could change between now. It's way too early to make the decision here in May. I mean, we're not playing until September. So it's our hope that we can operate a stadium at full capacity. Is that realistic? Time will tell, but certainly we don't want to talk about these different variations and have people panicked and upset, or am I in, am I out? It's just not worth it right now. I think everyone has to exercise a level of patience. We certainly are. And at some point in time, we'll come out with our information and decisions that we will make. But, we haven't begun to really talk about those except internally. And really, I haven't mentioned anything to President Moorhead or anyone else. Josh Brooks has taken the lead on that effort for us, and he's coordinated with a small group, internal group, on how to deal with that. But at some point in time, we'll talk about that, but we want to be sure when we do it, it's accurate, it doesn't change, and it doesn't create any confusion among our fan base.
Yeah, I think the phrase for this, when you start speculating about things that have yet to happen, is borrowing trouble, or trying to predict the weather 2 weeks in advance.
Right.
How much into communications have you been with Gary Stokan in the kickoff game and Virginia? I know that their re-socialization process and their state isn't where Georgia's is. Do you talk frequently Do you feel solid about Virginia being able to play that football game? And are there concerns, again, and or thoughts even, about playing an indoor game versus an outdoor game? I mean, how sad is it that if the season kicks off on time, it would be in an indoor stadium there in Atlanta?
Well, I spoke with Gary a couple of weeks ago, and we both agreed that we're still planning to play, as well as Carla. I mean, we're all planning to play the game, but what will be the mass gathering definition in Mercedes-Benz Stadium? When that is defined, then the schools will have to react to that, and we just don't know right now. But all plans are conduct the game with a full house, hopefully. If not, we'll make adjustments and go from there, and perhaps they'll have to open up the roof of the Mercedes-Benz Stadium to provide a little bit more air circulation, things of those lines. But great confidence in Gary, and obviously Carla. I think the world of her and what she's done up there. So it'll be a good collaborative discussion, and whatever happens, and we'll roll with the decisions as they're made.
Question I hear a lot of fans talk about is, well, geez, if I can't get in the stadium, can I at least tailgate? And I guess, as you said, we won't have to make that decision until the time comes. Would that be something that the university would oversee, though? Would that be something that you would control, or is it kind of like, well, it's outside the stadium, that's going to be left to the public officials?
I'm sure we'd be involved in the discussion, but that would be a university decision, because it handles obviously areas that are not under the supervision of athletics. So we'd work in concert with the university and come to some decision, but we have not had those conversations at this time until I think we have more clarity on mass gatherings.
You've been very measurable throughout this whole process. And I think you've put out the information, in concert with Greg Sankey. You haven't overstepped your bounds. I know some ADs out there kind of throw some things out in the wind and they twist a little bit. That's just not your style. What you say, you mean. What you mean, you say. Another note on this, though, Greg, Georgia's kind of had a reputation, and not in a bad way, for being conservative. And you and I talked about this when we did the story. I did the FOIA request, and I found out that there was a $105 million reserve fund. While only 41% of the FBS schools have any reserve fund at all, Georgia is sitting on enough to be comfortable. Comfortable is a bad word, but capable of weathering this storm. And yet I look and see Georgia spending more on football recruiting than any program in the country. And I see $170 million in facilities. You better be careful there. They're going to start calling you a little bit more of a riverboat gambler going after these facilities and this. But you talked about spending on recruiting, spending all that money and spending on the facilities. Can you share some insight into why you're comfortable with that spending?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we spend a lot more because we do not have a school aircraft. For instance, other institutions have one or two aircraft, and probably they're just charging to their specific sports budget gas and maybe a few expenses, to where, when we rent an aircraft right now, it'd be like you or me just going to Georgia Jet or Delta Net Jets and chartering a flight. So there's obviously going to be a premium on that. We don't have the capital expense that the other schools had, and the $7 or $8 million is to purchase an aircraft or pilots or insurance or maintenance. So, we constantly evaluate, should we get back in the aviation business, and those discussions will be had for another day. So it's never apples and apples. Basically we spend whatever money Kirby needs to get the job done. As you could see by this year's class, a lot of kids from outside the state of Georgia. So that created obviously more distance to travel, more flights than getting in your car and go. But I think from one thing that I was fortunate, and several of our staff were fortunate to know Joel Eves, who became the athletic director back, and obviously hired Coach Dooley. But those of us that knew Coach Eves and worked with him, you talk about fiscal responsibility. And even when the budget was in $3 or $4 million, Coach Eves counted every dime, because he knew how important it was to be solvent. And so that carried on with Coach Dooley. And so I've had great training with Coach Dooley, with Lee Haley. Those that knew Lee Haley, he was the absolute best as far as budget control. So I've just been fortunate to be hanging around a lot of people that think like I do. And that's kind of where I learned how to manage things. And that philosophy is spending your money like it's your own money. And yes, probably we could be labeled many things, but I've always felt like that the financial, our finance committee and the financial experts would probably give us a big check mark for the way we've conducted our business. And unfortunately, those that might not be really that knowledgeable of financial best practices weigh in. And obviously, it's coming back to help us now with our reserve. But you mentioned our reserve number. It's not that number right now because the Dow's down. So much of that is dependent upon the stock market. So we still have significant funds, which would help us weather the storm maybe for a year. But certainly any longer than that is really dangerous territory.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how you manage your coaches and the Kirby relationship. We talked about it a little bit earlier, and I think the conclusion that you shared with me was you try to support the coach's vision. Every coach has their own vision. How long did it really take you to get in sync with Kirby? I mean, was this something that clicked right away? Because obviously, he's a whirling dervish. He has a lot of ideas. He's aggressive, as you mentioned. He's you say get the job done at Georgia. That means win a championship. Now the expectations have gone through the roof. How long did that relationship take to settle into, and how easy is it now before you talk to the league office about a schedule, for example? You go armed with the knowledge of what your football coach is comfortable with.
Well, I knew right away when we talked to Kirby about the job what was going to be necessary. So what you don't want is you hire someone and then you say, "Well, golly, we didn't talk about that." I think the neat thing about it was that Kirby's expectations. Kirby, what are your expectations? Tell us a little bit about your vision. Tell us a little bit about where you think we need to take this program and how we do that. And when you're able to articulate that in a very marked manner, it gives a level of confidence in me, and I'm sure it did with President Moorhead too, that he's got his act together. He knows what it takes. So from an athletic director's position, you have to absorb that information and say, are we ready? Will we commit to do A, B, and C? And we knew we would. And so it was very clear up front. We've had a great relationship as far as facilities. It might take a tad bit longer than others, but we have tremendous resources on campus that help us to make sure that the end product is going to be obviously there forever. And so we want to build it to where the lifespan of the building may be 50, 100 years. And we just don't throw things up. I think those of us that have seen the finished product, whether it be tennis or whether it be equestrian or golf, any one of our facilities, they walk in there and they say, this is really special and really makes us proud. So it may take us a little bit longer to do certain things, but certainly the end result is what matters. And I think everyone that's seen the three major football projects, or the two at least for now, have been so pleased with it. And I'm certainly confident they'll feel that way when we're occupying the phase one of the new Butts-Mehre expansion in April of 2021.
Yeah, certainly the indoor football facility is impressive, as is the West End Zone. I was going to ask you about the update. You can't look out your window and watch me. You're not sitting in your office on campus where you can see the bulldozers pushing dirt every. How is it still on schedule for the $81 million football building as far as that timeline?
Yeah, Mike, we've had great weather in general, and contractors doing a great job. We're on schedule. The steel's flying. You now have a sense of how tall the building's going to be. You have a sense of how large the weight room floor. I think they're fixing to pour the floor of the weight room very soon, and it'll just take shape. It's really an impressive facility. It kind of tells you how large this is going to be. It's a 3-story facility, 3 levels rather, but it's really going to be impressive. And our goal is at the end of the project, once we're done with everything, that it looks like it's always been there. And so it'll it will abut the indoor athletic facility, and it'll look very similar in exterior to the indoor building, but it's going to be dynamic, and we just can't wait to watch the progress continue.
When is that supposed to be completely? I think phase one was supposed to be February next year, maybe?
Well, April of 21 is phase one, and then we'll take 6 months to finish everything. So January of 22 will be when the entire project's over. But we'll be able to occupy a lot of new spaces in April of 21 around spring practice next year.
It's pretty cool. A minute ago you were talking about sitting down with Kirby and getting his visions. When we talk with you, you talk like a marketing guy. You talk about the numbers, and yet when somebody looks into your background, they might be surprised, or maybe not. Maybe they should know by now. You were a student athlete at Georgia. You were a tennis player. You were a tennis coach. You worked in sports. Do you think that background as an athlete and as a coach helps you relate to your coaching staff? Because as I look at the ADs, and you're the second longest tenured in the SEC behind Mitch Barnhart, I see more and more marketing guys and less coaches. That, I guess, coaches make enough now they can retire, but do you think that background gives you an advantage, having worked as a coach, having been a student athlete yourself, and even having worked in sports information and having a journalism degree, where you kind of understand how this whole thing works?
Well, I was fortunate to work under the arm of Dan McGill, who back at that time was the men's tennis coach, the director of the Georgia Bulldog Club, and also the sports information director. So at a very early age, I was exposed to so many wonderful things. I knew in high school, I said, I want to work in college athletics. I was hooked. And so, I was fortunate enough to, I use the term loosely, play tennis at Georgia. I think realistically, Dan McGill was just being very nice to me to letter me in 1973 as a freshman, because you can go down the record books and my name is nowhere near any records there. So, but you know what it did give me? It taught me what it's like to be the life of a manager, a life of a coach, a life of a student athlete, and to do any chore that's asked. I remember as a young child picking up Coke bottles. Back in the day, you had a 3-cent deposit on a used 6.5-ounce Coke bottle, and if you loaded the Coke machine up with 24 Cokes, by golly, you better have 24 empties back in there, or Coach McGill is going to be counting, every Coke. So I was so fortunate to grow up in a time where I call it life was so simple. No cell phones, no computers. You dealt with people face to face. And, if you answered the phone at home, big deal. If you didn't, no answer machines. If you wanted to go change the TV channel, you just got up there. And I remember people used to fight to see who was going to change the channel. And now everything's so complex. But I do think it did help me give me a perspective from so many different angles. And again, I was just fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. And a lot of people have just been phenomenal mentors to me throughout the 43 years in college athletics now.
I was going to say, you went right from that to the coaching. You were doing administrative duties, the sports information duties, facilities duties. Greg, there's a quote that says, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. For 20 years, you worked at the University of Florida in their administration. Right. So not only do you know the landscape at Georgia, from being a helper with Coach McGill to being a scholarship athlete on tennis and an Athens product, you got Athens covered. But you know what's going on in there in Gainesville too. I guess I'll ask you, how much did you gather? How much translates from working administration at Florida, and how much do you learn? They're the competition. Let's face it, Georgia and Florida, they're cats and dogs. I guess gators and dogs. How much of an advantage was that for you to spend those 20 years there, and what did you bring back to Georgia from that experience?
Well, Mike, those 18 years were, I just called them kind of the golden years for the success that Florida had during that time, really in all sports. I mean, you name it, they were almost national championship competitive in really every sport, and had been doing that for a long, long time, long before I arrived there in 1992. So this had been something that had been ingrained in the Florida athletic program for a long, long time. But I did see, Jeremy Foley was a great mentor. He allowed me to get really inside the ropes as far as all the hirings that were made, the good ones and the bad ones. And when he had to terminate individuals, I was in the room. So that learning experience just helped me so much when I came to Georgia in 2010. But Georgia and Florida had been aligned in so many ways. Obviously, we played the game in Jacksonville every year, but there was always a level of cooperation, respect, even though we wanted to beat each other's brains out in competition. But at the field, we got together, and unfortunately now all the people that I worked with at the University of Florida, except for a couple, have either retired or moved on. So I know Scott Strickland's doing a great job down there, and Chip Howard, who I ran with for so many years, is back on the staff there at Florida. But a lot of people that are still remain great friends, and we stay in contact. Probably not as much as we should, but when we get together, we certainly relive some great times there, and just a lot of good people in college athletics, and especially my pals down in Gainesville or wherever they are now.
Yeah. A couple more questions before I let you go, Greg.
Yeah.
Evaluating coaches, you mentioned the difficult jobs that athletic directors have. It can't just be, your kids love you and you go to class. There is a requirement to win, and there are expectations when you're at an institution like Georgia with a beautiful campus, with the incredible city, with the academic ranking, and the coaches that are pretty well compensated. Do you evaluate your non-revenue coaches similar to how you evaluate your revenue coaches? Is there the same demand and the same evaluation process for them in terms of, how they're doing? I mean, we can look and see, Georgia wants to be competitive in the All Sports Trophy. I do think they've gotten more competitive, but as we look at it, how do you evaluate and know when it's time to make a change or to put the spurs to a coach and say, listen, we got to have results?
Well, every sport is unique. It's not a one size fits all. Obviously, we want to be competing for SEC championships. And if you're doing that, if you're in the hunt, you're more than likely going to be in the hunt on a national scale. But take, for instance, Tom Black in volleyball. I remember when Tom came to interview, we walked down the main hallway that's shared with swimming and volleyball. And you go down on the right-hand side and you see what Jack Bowerly has done at the University of Georgia for decades. They're Olympians, they're gold medals, SEC championships. And you go down the left side to volleyball, there's nothing there. So what Tom Black has to do to elevate our volleyball program is extremely difficult. So on the other hand, someone like Jack Bowerly, who's done just phenomenal things at Georgia, if Jack's not in the top 10, he's in the jar and he's upset. On the other hand, if Tom Black were in the top 10, there may be a parade for Tom downtown. So it's different depending on the history of the program. And we have some sports that don't have that legacy to fall back on. And what they're trying to do is create that. So it's not it's an imperfect science and evaluations across the board, but you've got to make sure that the student athletes are in a great environment, that coaches are constantly learning. I'm not perfect in that area, but I'm really, really feel great about our 15 head coaches and the work they're doing. But every sport's a little bit different, just depending on the historical part of it and their teams that surround them as well in the conference.
As we look at the landscape, we talk about the facilities. We talk about, obviously, football is the engine that drives the revenue train. I think everyone would agree that Kirby Smart has put the school in a great place. But, Greg, there could be top 5 picks in football. Andrew Thomas went top 5. Anthony Ant-Man Edwards is expected to go top 5. Emerson Hancock is projected as the top 5. We haven't even mentioned Matthew Bowling, who's certainly on a global scale. I think he would be considered. Can you remember a time and just how fulfilling is that as an AD where you turn, and for the people that haven't met these young men, you've run across them. These are also some pretty dynamic people and with good character.
Well, you mentioned those 3 individuals right there that are going to be at the top of the food chain in the Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NFL. And I can't remember a time that we've had the star quality that we have. You got Cole Wilcox also in baseball. It's going to be more than likely a first-round pick. Katarina Jokic in women's tennis, who's right up there. I mean, Chris Hack has a group of golfers that are consistently at the top. Katarina Don in women's golf. I mean, you can go down the whole list and see a remarkable list of individuals, but they're also great teammates, and I think they'd much rather see the team be successful than the individual accolades that they get. But there's a lot of star power, and it'll really be interesting to see how the baseball draft ends up and the NBA draft, because these young men and women have represented us so well And needless to say, like the NFL draft, to have 2 first-round draft picks, and the rest of the guys get picked up pretty quickly. And then Tay Crowder, who can ever forget Tay Crowder on maybe the biggest play of all, recovering the pooch punt kickoff or whatever against Oklahoma. If he doesn't go down and Rodrigo doesn't convert on that, we're down 17 instead of 14. So I think Tay Crowder's going to have a great career. And even though he was the last pick, he was a pick, which I think is a credit to Kirby for directing him, Glenn Schumann as his coach, and just the Georgia program in general to have those men selected.
Well, Greg, I've kept you a lot longer than I planned. I'll tell you what, you can throw this down in front of the ADs, tell them, say, you sit with a local guy for 45 minutes and answer one question after another. Boom, boom, boom. It just doesn't happen live, certainly not live. And it really is remarkable. And I appreciate the fact that you took this time for Dog Nation. And I've enjoyed watching your leadership. It all starts at the top. I've seen that with championship programs. Everybody's got to be on the same page, from the president to the AD to the coaches. And I think Georgia is in a really good place right now. I think you deserve a lot of credit for that.
Well, Mike, I appreciate it. I would just throw the credit to our staff. I'm blessed to have a great staff, and a lot of them. Even Claude Felton, the best in the my mentor as a student. Now we're working together, but I'm just blessed to be surrounded by a lot of talented people that help keep me straight, and certainly aren't afraid to speak up on things that need to be addressed. And I'm just blessed to be able to have them surrounding me and keep me straight.
Greg McGarity, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Greg.
Okay, Mike, be well, my friend. Take care.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Folks, you just don't see it. I'm going to tell you, ADs don't just do live interviews, spontaneously like that, and there's a reason. I mean, there's a level of trust there. Obviously, I'm not going to, we're not looking for any gotcha. But these are the questions that people want to know. And the reason Greg does that isn't because he's buddy or win. It's because he has a fan base that he wants to answer to. And having worked in sports information, he understands our job is to facilitate his knowledge and those answers that the university has to the general public and the fans. I mean, and this is how it's done. I mean, but to do it live, I'm going to tell you, that's really remarkable. Last week we had Tom Crane on for an hour.
Gotta go.
All right. See you. You're good. Thank you. Last week we had Tom Crane on for an hour. He did a remarkable job. You've seen some of the ESPN personnel come on here, whether it was Cole Kubelik or, Peter Burns or Chris Doring. We're going to keep trying to bring you these type of figures, these type of personalities, and certainly keep you informed with Georgia. Do our jobs. That's what we're all trying to do during this pandemic, is do our jobs, continue to serve. And I'll tell you what, my sponsor, Ingles, has done that and has been on the front line from the get-go. I appreciate everything that Ingles does for us. More importantly, I appreciate everything Ingles does for our communities. And, Michael Carvel is my producer. Michael, I hope that could you please run a video? I want to show people just how involved Ingles has stayed.
It's in our hearts to feel for you. There's been ups and downs, turnarounds, good days and some bad, but we stand together for worse and for better. We'll always have your back, with open arms, heart to heart, hand in hand, community strong.
Well, hey, folks, really appreciate the job Ingles doing. Can't say that enough times. And appreciate you joining us here. I know we did our programming a little different this week because of the Memorial Day weekend. Thank you for joining us. If you have more questions, ask them down below in the comment section. I'll go back in there and comment on them. You can follow me on Twitter as well, at Mike Griffith 32. Don't forget, tonight, Jeff Sentel, Before the Hedges. That's going to roll around 6 p.m. right here on this channel. You're not going to want to miss that. Jeff does an outstanding job with recruiting. And of course, as always, Brandon Adams, Dog Nation Daily, BA, back in studio, back in the saddle. And he was firing some fastballs at me earlier this morning on the program. So you can catch that here as well. So for my producer, Michael Carvel, Greg McGarity, I'd like to thank all of you for joining me. Everybody have a safe, wonderful Wednesday afternoon.